Ankara called it a milestone. Tehran described it as unprecedented. A 3-day trip by the Iranian chief of staff to the Turkish presidential complex. The talks were the first of their kind since the Iranian Revolution of 1979. So what's changed? Well, the blockade against Qatar in June by 4 Arab countries may have been a factor. The Saudi-led siege brought Tehran and Ankara closer when both sides backed Doha in the dispute. To get around the blockade, Ankara is flying in tons of food every day to the Gulf state and has just agreed to supply even more by going overland through Iran. And then there's the war in Syria. While General Mohammed Bakari was in Turkey, he also met his military counterpart to talk tactics. Another significant sign that the countries are prepared to walk side by side, given that Ankara wants Syria's Bashar al-Assad gone, while Tehran thinks he should stay. But now both nations have a common enemy in Idlib, where a group of al-Qaeda-linked fighters have gained control. There's also the Kurdish connection, since both countries host a sizable population. The meeting in Ankara focused on the fight against the PKK terror group in Turkey, as well as its Iranian offshoot. And plans by leaders of the Kurdish regional government to hold an independence referendum on September 25th also have Tehran and Ankara nervous about further political destabilization.
God forbid, it could even lead to a civil war. This is serious. We have clearly told them we are against this referendum, and they shouldn't hold it. We will continue to say that.
Finally, there's the economic bond. Around $14 billion worth of trade goes between the two countries every year, and that's soon expected to double. Iran also just signed a deal to become Turkey's second biggest gas supplier after Russia, promising enough of the natural resource to last 150 years. And with President Erdogan planning to visit Tehran in September, it seems like their relationship is only growing stronger. Vanessa Keneally, The Newsmakers.
Well, let's go to our panel now. Joining me in the studio is Tala Koze. He is an Associate Professor of Political Science at Ibn Khaldun University. From Marbella in Spain is the former Iranian diplomat Mehrdad Konsari. And from Washington, D.C., Ahmad Madija. He is a senior fellow at the Iran Observed Project at the Middle East Institute. Mehrdad Konsari, if I could start with you, why do you think this high-level delegation came to Ankara now?
Things between Iran and Turkey have improved dramatically over the last several months since President Erdogan took a different position regarding the outcome for the Syrian regime, whose destiny and fate was a very sensitive issue for the Iranian regime. Differences over Syria had cast a great deal of difference between Iran and Turkey. That has now been eliminated, and areas to be explored for further cooperation have opened up, and as a result of what has been happening in Qatar, what has been happening in the region in general, I think that the situation has never been more ripe for Iran and Turkey to come together, in particular in advance of the forthcoming referendum that is scheduled to be held on the 1st of October. And that is, of course, an area and an issue over which Iranian and Turkish sensitivities and concerns coincide.
Mehrdad, I think you've essentially set out the entire agenda for this debate. Let us start with the first issue that you mentioned, the change in approach with regards to Bashar al-Assad. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, the Turkish president was quite vocal and vehement in his opposition to Mr. Assad and to the fact that his regime had to go. But the situation on the ground, having changed in favor of Assad, especially after Russia's entry into the equation and the spat of differences that occurred between Turkey and Russia, for which the Turkish president was anxious to repair those differences, has led to a situation where he came out with a new position that in essence accepted the Assad regime remaining in power, which brought it obviously closer to Iran.
Let me just bring in our studio guest, Tala Köse, just from the Turkish side. Would you go as far as saying that President Erdogan and the Turkish government have accepted that eventuality?
Not necessarily. I mean, yes, I mean, certain things have changed on the field, but this is related to the changing position of the US, changing position of Europe, and changing position of the other countries that were also supporting the opposition. So for the moment, US and European position and the Gulf position with regard to the Syrian opposition changed drastically. So US insisted on supporting and arming the PKK-PYD in Syria, and their position is expanding in the Iraq as well. So Turkey has serious security concerns, and I think it was very difficult to maintain this position. So yes, Russian involvement in Syrian crisis changed the situation, but the second issue for Turkey was US insistence on supporting the PKK and PYD and increasing the region that's controlled by the PKK, PYD. So Turkey's security concerns are not taken seriously.
We're going to come back to that issue in a moment. First of all, let me bring in Ahmad Majadia in Washington. Why do you think, what is the most important reason for this coming together now?
Well, I partly agree with your first speaker that the latest steps taken by Iran and Turkey to improve their relations and find a common ground to cooperate more on regional issues of mutual concern should be seen within the changed regional dynamics because Turkey and Iran, they have had divergent policies in Iraq and they've been on opposite sides of the Syrian civil war. But from Iran's perspective, now they see themselves as winner, because the Assad regime is now in control of all the population centers, and Turkey-backed groups, they have lost territory. And as we see that the ISIS is on the brink of defeat in Iraq and also losing ground in Syria, it is Iran and its proxies that are filling that power vacuum. So Turkey wants to now, so Iran also wants to de-escalate tension with Turkey to sustain and consolidate its gains. But from Turkey's perspective, it also has international context as well, because President Erdogan has been disappointed by the Trump administration's refusal to halt its support for some of the Kurdish forces in northern Syria, and also take a more aggressive action against Iranian Shiite proxies in Syria and Iraq. So that's why it now wants to seek more cooperation with Russia and Iran to address some of its security and political concerns in the region.
Let's highlight some of the key reasons why the two countries are coming a little closer together. Mehrdad, you did mention the referendum that the Kurdish regional government in Iraq wants to hold on independence being one of the key reasons why Turkey and Iran are looking to cooperate. Just tell us why both countries fear that.
Well, of course, both Iran and Turkey have a large Kurdish population, and any change in the status of the Kurds in Iraq, were it to lead to independence, would inevitably have a knock-on effect as far as the Kurdish population in both Iran, Syria, and Turkey would be concerned. And so naturally, both Iran and Turkey share this common interest of wanting to wanting the Kurdish elements in Iraq to remain within Iraqi unitary state, albeit under a federal constitution, but oppose the idea of an independent Kurdistan, which could jeopardize the security of their internal security of their own countries. And obviously, this is a follow-on to the kind of concerns that other speakers spoke about regarding US and Western support for Kurdish elements in Syria, who Turkey perceives as a long-term threat to its own security, were they to be successful in the campaign that they're conducting at this time.
And now we heard President Erdogan talking today about the possibility of a joint operation. Let's have a listen to what he had to say.
As you know, the PKK terrorist organization has an Iranian arm called PJAK, and these two groups have constantly caused harm to both Turkey and Iran. If our two countries stand together in solidarity, these threats would come to an end in a very short time.
So Tala, the Turkish president talking about the possibility of joint military action. What do you think about that?
So both countries see expansion of PKK and PYD in the region as a security threat. So both countries actually agreed on the fact that they want to maintain unity of Iraq and Syria. But Turkey wanted a little bit more inclusive regime. But at this moment, as the fight against Daesh has been used as some kind of pretext to expand the control of PKK, PYD. And both Turkey and Iran are concerned that the emerging stripe in Iraq and Syria may be a long-term security challenge, long-term security problem, and this region is armed heavily by the US. So Iran is concerned that these weapons may be used in the future against Iran because Trump administration have some different views in comparison to Obama administration with regard to the Iranian issue. And Turkey is also concerned that a new political entity is emerging in Turkey's southern territories that is disconnecting from the Arab Middle East. So both countries have shared concerns, and the issue is that the PYD, PKK is heavily armed, and in the future, this Barzani-controlled area may be united with this emerging political entity, and it may create further political problem.
Do you think that Iran would like to move closer to Turkey, if only to ask Ankara to use its influence in northern Iraq to prevent that referendum going ahead?
I think it may be very difficult to control the situation if the KRG can, go through a process of independence. So neither Iran nor Turkey may be unable to control the future of the political developments, because this may further increase the civil war in Iraq, and it may turn into an Arab-Kurdish conflict, and it may unite other Kurdish entities together against both Turkey and Iran. So it may create counter-alliances, and it may be out of control.
You mentioned the Trump administration. Let's jump back to Washington now, and Ahmed Majid, tell me, do you think the Iranians now see Trump as so unreliable, so unpredictable when it comes to the Iranian nuclear deal, that they now start to look towards Turkey to insulate themselves against possible further sanctions coming out of Washington?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, because that's one of the key factors that Iran is trying to cultivate closer ties with Turkey. During the election campaign here in the United States, Iranian leaders were very optimistic about President Trump. Although they were very cautious about it, they thought that Trump was a businessman and could just deal with Russia and ultimately with Iran as well in Syria. But we saw that President Trump did quite the opposite. It has increased the sanctions on Iran, and even is threatening to canceling the Iran nuclear deal. So Iran wants to preempt that move, and is trying to cultivate closer relations with regional countries, including Ankara, not just in the political and security front, but also economic ties, in order to minimize the impact of any economic sanctions by the United States.
Mehrdad Konsari, what is your take on the US administration's influence on this situation? Do you think they are somehow driving both Turkey and Iran closer together?
Well, I think they are. They have inadvertently driven Turkey and Iran closer together. But you have to bear in mind that when it comes to the Kurdish referendum and the prospect of an independent Kurdish state, the United States official policy is on the side of both Iran and Turkey. So there is total agreement that with the United States, in the sense that no party wants an independent Kurdish state within Iraq. So that particular part of it shows the closeness of positions. And of course, you have to bear in mind that the war against ISIS, in which Iran has been a party and Turkey has been a party, is again another point of convergence with the United States, both in Iraq and Syria. So the situation is a little bit more complicated, and we have not yet seen the kind of teeth that President Trump has sort of shown the effects of that in a real sense against Iran, though there's been much rhetoric and lifting, upgrading of sanctions, which doesn't have that much effect.
Mehrdad, you were a diplomat with Iran for many years and many years ago, and you were an expert on the country's relations in the Gulf. Let's take us to perhaps our last issue of this debate, and that is the situation with Qatar and its neighbours. To what extent is that driving Iran and Turkey closer together? And did you expect the two to come out on Qatar's side against Saudi Arabia and the others?
Again, this was a more difficult decision for Turkey to take than for Iran, because Iran was on the opposite side of the equation so long as the GCC countries, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and all the others were united in their positions. And, the flagging up of this Shia-Sunni divide over the years had exacerbated that. And Turkey was, of course, trying to cultivate its ties with both Saudi Arabia and Qatar, but mainly with Qatar. So the surprise factor was the position in which Turkey took vis-a-vis Qatar in respect to Saudi Arabia. And of course, Qatar, by becoming isolated from Saudi Arabia, who is leading the regional charge against Iran, again, essentially forced Iran to come out openly in support of Qatar and bring its position closer to Turkey. This happened inadvertently. I don't believe that this was a calculated move, but on the other hand, it does serve to bring both Turkey and Iran closer together on this issue and forge closer cooperation on other issues as a result of this.
Tala Köse, we've heard recently that Turkey is considering using a land route via Iran into Qatar in order to supply the country, which has found itself isolated by Saudi Arabia and others. Can you just explain to our viewers why Turkey, which has a very close relationship with Saudi Arabia, is helping Qatar, which is also being aided by Iran?
Yeah, I think the objective of this last initiative that was led by Saudi Arabia and UAE is to create some kind of bipolar system within the Gulf and in the Middle East. So Iran is already in one side of the story, one side of the pole, and Turkey and Qatar used to play in between. So Turkey was trying to have good relations with Saudi Arabia and Iran as well, at least have some balanced relationship. And Qatar was at the same time playing the similar role. And actually, Oman and Kuwait were also in the similar position. So with that last move, they wanted to polarize and push Turkey at least outside of this game, or at least be part of this Sunni organized pole. So Turkey's successful diplomacy in the Qatar crisis kept this polarization. At least Turkey maintained its position. It didn't necessarily get into further escalation with Saudi Arabia, and maintained its relation with Iran, and maintained the autonomy of the Qatar. So that was very important for Turkey. Turkey really don't like the emergence of such a bipolar, sectarian-oriented system in the Middle East. And also this kind of, Turkey also considered that this is not an internal driven thing. So some people from the Trump administration also encouraged emergence of such a system in the region. So keeping that kind of balance and increasing the influence of the regional actors, including Saudi Arabia and Iran, was major concern for Turkey.
Tala Köse, Ahmed Majidiyar and Mehrdad Konsari in Marbella. Thank you all so much for joining us on Newsmakers.